Namaskar and welcome to this week's webinar on the book Living Wisely, Living Well, in which we take a daily reading from this book and we share thoughts about this. And before I read this today's reading, I'd like to just explain something that I find interesting in this book. And Swamiji takes each day and shares some inspiration on a certain topic. It's inspirational, but it's also educational. And we are in the month of May, and he has taken 1 week in the month of May in which he has addressed each day to a specific color, which I find quite interesting. And today's, of course, is one of those colors, and it's the color green. And which is obviously it's very appropriate here at this time of year because I'm broadcasting this from Ananda Village in California right now, where I'm visiting. And everything outside, as you walk out the door, everything is green because it's springtime here. And after a long winter when no trees or the trees have no leaves and things are not growing, and it's a little bit colorless. Now when springtime comes, April, May comes, everything turns green and you find flowers coming up in the fields, and it's quite beautiful. And so this is an appropriate color for today's reading. And so let me read this, what Swamiji says. It's from Living Wisely, Living Well. And he says, green is the color of health and harmony. It is most visible among growing things. Green gives a heightened sense of physical and mental well-being. Where there is a focus on health, however, there can also be one on ill health. Unpleasant shades of green can disturb the feelings. Green, therefore, is associated also with harmful emotions, such as envy and jealousy. Isn't that interesting? It's somewhat ironic that the same color, which we can associate with health and vitality, also is the very opposite in some senses. When a person is not feeling well, we might say to somebody, gee, you're looking a little bit green today, as if they're not feeling well. Or you might say a person is green with jealousy. But yet, on the other hand, like I said when I began, it's associated with vitality, with physical rejuvenation. We look outside and there's health, and it's not only physical, but also mental. And there's an enthusiasm that comes in springtime when everything is new, things are coming up. People want to go outside, and oftentimes it's that time of year people undertake new projects, and really it's the beginning of the year. Not so much January 1st in the middle of winter, but really when springtime comes, that's when the year really seems to begin, in nature at least. Everything's new and bursting forth. I remember back something from the life of Paramahansa Yogananda. And when he first came to America, he after a couple of years of coming to learn the culture, he began a decade almost of constant touring about the United States, going from one city to another city, raising funds to spread his message and spread the word, to reach out to people with the message of Kriya and with the message of yoga. And he was intensely busy. And one of the topics that he would often address when he was going to lecture halls is he would use this topic of everlasting youth. And again, here green is associated with youth and vitality. And he would begin to speak about something that most people in some level of want, is that this sense of everlasting youthfulness, body, mind, and soul. And so he would speak on that topic. And in a sense, he would begin by talking about everlasting youth from the physical sense. And he would introduce his spiritual message first through that medium. And so he would talk about ideas of vegetarian diet, healthful living, ways to improve our health through perhaps physical means, through yoga. And isn't this even true today, that many people come to these teachings of Kriya Yoga, of meditation. They come through the door of physicality, of first becoming introduced to feeling better, more fit, more healthy. They practice yoga, improve the body. And this is natural. People have that desire to be youthful in the physical sense because you feel better. You feel that vitality, you feel that energy of youth. And so he would speak to that first, but then he would slowly then begin to take it a little bit deeper, because what is that vitality that we're feeling? It's the life force in the body. How do we control that life force? How do we direct that life force? How can we draw more life force into the body? And he would take the conversation to a little bit more subtle level. And then he would come even a little bit more deeper. Then he would say, well, what is youth really? And this youthful feeling is mostly the state of mind. Yes, the body reinforces that naturally at a certain point in our life, but we do not need to identify ourselves with the passing of time, and as time goes by, people begin to age. That youth essentially is how we think and that state of mind that we have within us. And he said what we should have all of our life is this a state of mental everlasting youth. He often would comment and use the phrase that some people, by the time they're 21 or 30, are psychological antiques. In other words, their inability to change. And when we think of something as youthful and vital and that vitality, they're springy. They're able to make changes. They're adaptable. But people very shortly, sometimes they grow up and they go about their adult life, and they become very rigid and they lose that springiness of youth and that sense of greenness of being fresh to whatever it is that life gives to them, and they become antique. Sometimes he would say it was difficult to teach the teachings to somebody after they got to be 35 or 40 years old. They were over the hill, you might say, not so much physically, but mentally, spiritually, in a sense, they become rigid and they lose that flexibility. But on the other hand, there were others that would come to him late in life that were still fresh, still had that vitality, still had that openness of mind. And there were a number of very elderly people that came to him very late in life, yet in a very quick time were able to attain very high states of consciousness. And Master used to say, this is what we want to be. We want to have that freshness, that mental vitality that doesn't bind us into thinking that the time is passing and how things used to be. You know how old people start to talk after a time. In the good old days, this was this way, and they can't adapt to what's happening now. Well, why is it that some people begin to age, you might say age, not so much physically, but mentally, or you might even say ultimately, even spiritually, they are no longer flexible? And he said, Master said, it's because we identify with change. Everything is changing in this. Change is a constant. It's a fact of life. It's something that's part of this creation, is that we perceive change. Now, in reality, the yogis say in the highest state, there is no change. It's all one. Change is an illusion of passing. But we identify with that illusion of change. And as we identify with it, we begin to think of ourselves as old. We begin to see ourselves now as passing through time. Now, it's true. The body, the imperatives of the body, they do change. We begin to pass through time, but mentally we need not identify with those changes that are taking place, at least not to the point where it begins to affect our state of consciousness and takes us into a state of rigidity. Oftentimes, I find it somewhat a little bit annoying that obviously I'm not a spring chicken in a sense of being 18 years old or 20 years old anymore. And so the body has its ways and it slows us down a little bit. But people come, I was riding on the metro up in Delhi not too long ago, and I was riding along and I was feeling fine. And I came in and all of a sudden people, were insisting I sit. which was, I thought was a very nice gesture, you know, and a very nice gesture, and I appreciated the gesture. But on the other hand, there was this little thing in my mind, I don't need to sit, you know, this fellow here, you know, he's half my age, but he looks like he could use that more than me. But in other words, I didn't like the idea that I'm old. Now, I'm not rigid about this. I realize the body has its needs. But on the other hand, and I didn't mind other people necessarily looking at me that way, but I in my own self, I thought, I'm not old. I'm the same person I was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, maybe for good or bad. Maybe that's not such a good thing to have the same, but that the soul is immortal. That sense of self is immortal. Even the ego, Master said, is immortal. It remains, and it does not change. The ego really doesn't, and this is an interesting concept, another topic. But the sense of don't identify with the changes that are taking place around us, and we find that then we find that we maintain that spirit of youthfulness, or the sense of enthusiasm, or we at least fend off those delusions that come when we think of ourselves, oh, now I'm old. And pretty soon you begin to take on the actual trappings of that. And so keep yourself, you don't want to necessarily identify with the latest fashions that come and go. Be appropriate, but yet don't identify. And this is one reason I think Yogananda said, when people would ask how old he was, he wouldn't like to say in terms of, he would say maybe one, you know, and because of that birthday party where he went to and there was one candle. And I thought, yes, I'm one. Years passed. And so consequently, you don't have to say I'm this or I'm that, because then you start thinking, oh, well, a person that's this age, this is how they behave. No, you behave according to what's appropriate. And I think this is a nice thing among spiritual devotees, is we relate to each other as souls, not as to our physical outward identity determined by age. And so everlasting youth of mind and spirit comes when we no longer identify with this body, and we're the spirit, and we find that we're unchangeable, and that's who we are. Well, green, this color of green, of course, is associated with youth. It's a vitality, with energy, with enthusiasm, with growing. You could do it. This is why I think, too, if looking around this studio that I'm recording this in, I see there's very little green in here. And I think if you look at your office where you work during the day, take a look. What do you see there? This is why it's sometimes good to bring in a plant, or bring in something that is alive rather than is strictly technological. In today's society, we live so much with computers and mechanical things that sometimes we begin to alienate ourselves from the natural world. And my technician here just brought a plant out, so it's standing in front of me, and that we can introduce that world into our life, and so we don't alienate ourselves from it. But there's also another aspect when we think of green and growing things, that green is also associated with growth. Something needs to grow, and I think when we take green into our spiritual life, it reminds us that we too, although change may be an illusion, growth is not. There is a spiritual direction in which we're moving, and so we need to consider, are we growing? Now we see the physical body changing, and we see our moods changing, we see our mental state changing, and we see ourselves going through challenges in life, but are we growing? That's not necessarily the same thing. Growth is something that's moving us toward greater and greater perfection in this world, learning our lessons in life, learning to be able to adapt those things, learning to be able to expand our consciousness, to be able to expand our sympathies, learning to be larger. Isn't it so when the plants grow, as the tree becomes larger, the grass grows from small to large? Are we growing larger? in the sense of our sympathies, our understanding, our spiritual awareness, our awakening. This is something that is important for us to have a sense of growth, but also a reality of that growth. We don't want to be stagnant in life. And this is what happens also sometimes to people in the spiritual life. Or let's take it away from the spiritual life for a moment, just in terms of their, because you could say everything in life is spiritual. We're all growing, whether we're aware of it or not, or whether we're consciously striving toward a defined end or not. We're all growing. And sometimes people, they grow up physically and then they come and to a point in their life where they become stagnant. And you find this. People say, oh, I'm going through a midlife crisis. And that person, what they're saying is they've realized they've got to a certain plateau in life, and they realize, is that all there is? Isn't there something more in life? I'm not growing anymore. And often they'll want to make some major change in their life, not necessarily a good change simply for change's sake. But really what we want to do is we want to change and continue to look at ourselves. Am I growing? And to begin to do those things that stimulate and pave the way for further spiritual growth. So think about it and try to, in whatever way you can, to keep your spiritual life fresh and growing, looking for new ways to do something, looking for new insights, looking for new lessons, and not becoming comfortable with the way things are. There's a basic principle that I've discovered in life is we're either growing, expanding, or we're contracting. Rarely, and once in a while you cross that point where things are the same, but you don't stay there for long. You can rest in a moment, but then sooner or later you're going to go one way, and it's usually going to be downward unless you're making some effort to move in the other way. And so don't find that point of rest and think you're going to be just, now I can relax and rest for the rest of my life. No, it doesn't work that way. You have to be continually using your will, using your creativity, using your higher consciousness to expand. And when you expand, there's a natural sense of joy that comes. And this is why when people are growing in something, they're happy. Because there's joyfulness in growth. There's joyfulness in expansion. But when a person is stagnant, they've come to that point of rest, it's the prelude, I think, is what they're feeling for a sense of, I'm contracting. And when there's contracting, a sense of getting smaller, more confined, there's a sense of there's suffering that comes because joy is diminishing, and that is what suffering is. It's a diminishment of joy. And so we have to do whatever is in life that's going to take us up, you might say. Just as a plant, when it comes up, it grows up, it sprouts up, and just as a tree, it puts on new leaves. There's freshness to that. And so this is what we want to. We want to be continually fresh. Now, one of the things that happens, of course, and we have to be aware of, is that when we feel this burst of enthusiasm, we feel this joyfulness, we feel this new energy coming, what's the immediate impulse, tendency to go? We have this saying, you remember, up versus down, in versus out. The first impulse is when you feel a sense of upliftment, is to take it out, to go out through the senses. Oh, I feel so great, I'm going to go get an ice cream. Or I feel so great, I'm going to do this or that or another thing. Now, yeah, okay, I'm not saying we should live our life as in a dismal grayness within. I said we want to express your joy. Yes, that's good. But remember that the joy that we're seeking and we're impelled to look for outside of ourselves, that joy is really something that we're experiencing inside. The joy is not out there, so I feel all this enthusiasm to now get myself involved in this new quagmire of complication in life. When you fill in the blank, whatever that might be. For example, excuse me, but over the years I've seen people that they've been in bad relationships. or let's put it this way, relationships that have made them unhappy. It wasn't the relationship always that made the problem. It was their ability to adjust to it or to handle it properly. And so time goes by, they get to a certain point, and they terminate that relationship. And they say, oh, thank God, now what do? A little time goes by, and oh, I found my new loved one. And they immediately have jumped into a new one. And it's the same, but yet they're bringing the same old delusions from the past into the new situation. Now that sort of springtime fever is not what we're talking about here. We're saying is when you feel that upward enthusiasm, remember the joy is in here. And yes, we can see that reflected outside of ourselves and appreciate it. So consequently, I appreciate the beautiful flowers are coming up over at the Crystal Hermitage where Swamiji lived. He loved tulips and flowers. It wasn't that he loved tulips. He loved the beauty that tulips reflected. And so consequently, we have a very beautiful tulip garden there. And every spring, the tulips come up. And it's wonderful. And it reminds us, you see, that beauty that we see outside of ourselves reminds us of a deeper beauty within. And I think in Swami's case, I think he probably had lived very consciously on the astral plane for a period of time. And when he came down here to do his job this year, or in this lifetime, he remembered that beauty from that astral plane. And so he loved beautiful music because it reminded him of that. He loved beautiful scenes, he loved flowers, and he tried to express beauty in his life and encouraged us also in our life, and I encourage you, is to look for beauty in life and try to express that beauty. But remember that beauty is a reflection of something higher. Astral beauty, or that beauty, if we can perceive it outside, means that we probably can perceive it inside. And so this, when you see beauty, an artist see beauty, artists create beauty, they're trying to outwardly project something that's beautiful within themselves. And some artists, of course, don't see beauty, they see conflict, and so they'll express it outwardly. But what Swamiji used to always say is, if you're going to express, why not express something that's inspirational, that's going to remind you and going to remind others of a higher state of consciousness? And so he would, in his house, he would like to hang beautiful pictures or a little piece of statuary or whatever it would be, as a reminder of that higher state of consciousness toward which we all aspire. So you might also look at your surroundings. Are they beautiful? Try to bring a little bit of that beauty into your life, just as we maybe bring a plant into our office. Try to bring something of beauty inside your own world, and you'll find that environmental effect will begin to remind you of something higher within yourself. But when you go outward and you just simply think that beauty is out there, you feel that spring, that rising of energy, and immediately you send it out. Eventually, as Swami says, just as with green is expressed as in youth, vitality, enthusiasm. It also, green, a different shade of that green, is also representative of ill health as well, because this world is always dual in its nature. There's ups and there's downs. And so when you go outside with that enthusiasm only outwardly and forget the inner, you'll find that yes, spring is beautiful, but eventually it turns into autumn and back into winter, summer, winter, autumn, spring. You must experience the opposites outwardly, and the ups and the downs of life, the pleasures, and then ultimately the pain, the joys and the sorrows. Yet, even that, you can watch those passing before you as a movie screen. Master would take his disciples to the movies sometimes, see what's going on the screen, but realize it's always the divine light shining on that screen. So yes, you can see the ups and downs passing, but yet if your identity is not in the movie screen, but your identity is in the beauty that's inside, that's who you are, and that's unchangeable. And I think this is what nature and green is doing for us. It's reminding us, you might say, it's reminding us of something that is more that's within us. It's reminding us of that inner beauty that we see outwardly. And he says, yes, God, yes, thank you. I'm being reminded of that beauty within myself. And that beauty inwardly doesn't fade with the seasons. I know the grass that's so beautifully waving green. In another month or two, it'll be brown. Then the fires come, maybe, burn it out. The trees, they lose their leaves. It all passes. But I enjoy it right now because it reminds me. But yet, that's not who I am. Just as I look at this body age, and I enjoy the play, you might say the drama of your child, as Nandamoyi Ma used to say, when I was a child, I was just the same. When I was a young girl, I was just the same. Now that she was saying that when she was in the elder state of her life, I'm just the same. Nothing has changed. It's just this body comes, this body passes, but I remain inwardly associated with the soul, that divine nature of beauty, that everlasting youth that never changes. And that's who we want to be. We want to be that, have that youthful spirit, youthful sense, a sense of growth and vitality. Share that with other people. And whatever happens outwardly, nature takes its course. But we remain one and identified with that which never changes. God bless all of you, and we hope to see you again next week on Living Wisely, Living Well.